Hey everyone, despite my shirt, we are not in Gettysburg today. I am here at Bolivar Heights and/or Harpers Ferry, which is just between that gap way down there. And I have come here today because I want to mention a couple things about this area that I think are quite important. When it comes to this area, when it comes to Harpers Ferry, you know, everybody knows that it was a big part of the Civil War. Got the sun issue again, so I'm walking backwards again. Everybody knows it was a big part of the Civil War, but a lot of people miss a lot of other reasons why this area was so important during that time. Now, I mentioned Bolivar Heights and I mentioned Harpers Ferry. They're kind of two different, well, I mean, they're kind of two different battles, but it's the same general area. So I am on Bolivar Heights right now. This was the first attempted takeover of this area. It wasn't a full-fledged takeover. There was a, I think you could almost call it a probatory or a probing attack, if you will. One of those where, you know, troops try to feel each other out. They try to assess troop strength, fortifications, stuff like that, and then report back to their superiors. It could have been something like that. I'm not entirely sure the reasons for the first attack here at Bolivar Heights, but excuse me, the first incident occurred here at Bolivar Heights, not Harpers Ferry, exactly 2 years after John Brown's raid. And we're about to get a little look here at the, well, here's some more signage. It's not the one I was hoping for. Across the Potomac, blah 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 blah. That's not the right sign. Basically, you had two commanders kind of squaring off here. You had of course the Confederates moving into the area because the area was already somewhat occupied by Union forces. At this point, it was not really heavily stocked with troops or fortifications or anything like that. That would come just a little bit later. But let me see. Is this the sign I need? No, it's not the sign I need. What is this? So I'll show you guys. Rats in a cage. Rats in a cage. That was the Union troops after the 1862 incursion. I just want to get the names right, guys, here. As far as the first battle took place. So the first battle was the Battle of Bolivar Heights. The Confederate colonel was Turner Ashby. Turner Ashby is moving in with only 500 men. So like I said, this is I don't want to call it a minor event, but it was probably probatory. Ashby is moving in, and the area right here that I'm standing on is being defended by John White Geary. John White Geary ends up being victorious and holds off the Confederate troops. Fast forward about a year later, and we are in 1962, and we're looking at the Maryland campaign. So this is really one of the biggest engagements that happened at this area. Stonewall Jackson, of course, is moving along through the Shenandoah with Robert E. Lee, but the decision is made at some point to detach Stonewall Jackson and moving on to Garrison because they thought they could do it, and they were right. Basically, let me see. I don't get the sides of the river right. On the right side here, you are looking at Maryland Heights, that big ridge off to the right. On the left side, you are looking at Loudoun Heights. So, Stonewall Jackson was very smart and deliberate in his attack. Both sides knew the area pretty well, I think. But instead of rushing into it, even though he had a fair amount of troops with him, he takes all the high enemy positions first. He takes Maryland Heights over there. He takes Loudoun Heights over there. Then he finally moves in on Harpers Ferry. Harpers Ferry is being commanded by a man named Dixon Miles. He was a hero of the, I think, the Mexican-American War. And he already had kind of like one of my favorites, Lew Wallace. He had already had some issues in his career, and after this, his legacy was pretty much done in, if not for his defeat, also for the fact that a piece of shrapnel ended up killing him towards the end of the siege. Of course, at this area also in 1863, troops are passing once again on their way up to, you know, through Maryland, through Frederick, and then up to Gettysburg. And then one more time in 1864, Harpers Ferry is once again the site of an important passing that would lead to a fairly major event, which would be one of my favorite parts of the Civil War, the Battle of Monocacy in Maryland, right outside of Frederick, where a very, very brave Union general, General Lew Wallace, made a miraculous, not victory, but he miraculously held off the rebel advance onto Washington, saved Washington from a bit of damage, and saved Lincoln from a lot of embarrassment. So this area was passed through 3 times, and there's a lot to be said for that, because there's a sign. Hopefully maybe I can find it before I wrap this up, because I've got to make these things kind of quick. But you can't imagine the horrors that a town like this faces. So I've done Gettysburg a lot, right? We have to remember that Gettysburg was 3 days only, and Gettysburg, I'm not sure how to really draw the comparisons and contrasts here. Put it to you this way: Gettysburg was, I think, a little bit bigger of a town, had a slightly higher population. It was more rooted with the farms and everything. In other words, people couldn't easily pack up and go. When they had to pack up and go from here, it was a little bit easier than leaving your farm behind, all your equipment and all your animals behind, right? But the people here endured just a ridiculous amount of horror, of hardship, of seeing all their things destroyed. This whole landscape was destroyed and razed. Almost all the trees you see down in the gorge or up on these heights, I mean, not almost all the trees, but many trees. Much of the timber up there on the ridges was felled for the use of both troops. They carved earthworks. Hey, look, you can see the ridge if you look real closely dead ahead. That is probably the hiking ridge for Loudoun Heights, which I've been up on, and hopefully I'll take you guys on again this year. And up on that ridge, you can also see some of the old fortifications, some of the old batteries. But the people of Harpers Ferry, it may be fair to say, and others have said this, is not my original thought, the people of Harpers Ferry may have had the shortest straw in the entire Civil War of prolonged occupation. Just, you know, outright martial law, destruction to property, to their land, to their whole town. In fact, when the conflict began, I think I'm kind of near the sign, guys. When the conflict began, the town's population, you know, it wasn't a flea speck, like I said. I mean, there was something to it. I think in the low thousands. Hopefully the sign says right up here. But by the time the conflict was over, well, by the time of the end of the Civil War, more or less, after both troops had come through this area and just, you know, wreaked havoc and laid everything to waste, you know, passing after passing after passing, by the time it was all said and done, there were, I think, only 600 residents left, which is really, really hard to imagine. I think this is a sign, and then I'll probably sign out, guys. I'm gonna go down to go into town, of course, do some sightseeing, hang out on the river a bit. That's not it. It's got to be this one. Yeah. Okay. Let's see here. It was 3,000, so I wasn't, you know. Well, that's being off a bit. It was 3,000 civilians here in Harpers Ferry. Let me give you, just if you want to read the signs, you can pause and what have you, or come back. 3,000 residents to fewer than 600. That's just awful. I can't imagine living in an area like that where you have to constantly sulk around, you have to constantly tiptoe around guards, oftentimes perhaps be intimidated, oftentimes perhaps even be accosted to some degree, have your possessions taken from you, have your house commandeered, so on and so forth. I mean, for years. Can you imagine that happening in your town for years? That was the Civil War. That's what I want to emphasize on you know, again, my aspect of looking at things as a social historian. Doesn't have so much to do with the precise movements of the battles, which general, you know, had which troops under him, and what their rank and division and which corps they belong to and all this stuff. I mean, again, that stuff is great, and I love the guys, and I watch those guys who talk about that stuff all the time. But that's not what I do. My emphasis is on the social history, how it affected society, how it affected these towns, the horror, I mean, of having to, you know, hold a hospital while some guy is in there hacking limbs away at a rate that is just hard to contemplate. It's insane. You know, the makeshift hospitals that sprouted up all along this countryside between Maryland and Pennsylvania, not just in Gettysburg, but in places like Frederick, in places like this, so on and so forth. It was an awful, awful war. I just want to repeat it one more time. It shouldn't have happened. Oh, there's one thing I got to do real quick. Okay, John, I'm gonna try to fit in it. Okay, this whole thing is Harpers Ferry is no, you know what, guys, I'm gonna cut it off. I'm gonna get back to John Brown, perhaps down there in town. Okay, maybe I'll stop by the garrison and give a little talk about John Brown, the Freemason, and his Freemason accomplices, who very much were coordinating this as a false flag to lead us into war. There's plenty of evidence that I've come across now to strongly suggest that. I don't want to call it proof. You can, you know, read these things, and I'll give you the information in a little while when I'm down there, and hopefully do that video. But, you know, you can look into them more. You can make up your own minds. But the fact is, John Brown was a Mason. A lot of his accomplices were Masons, and a lot of this has some real ugly behind-the-scenes confluences of how we ended up to this, to bodies all over the countryside, and hospitals everywhere, and just human misery on a scale that most people today cannot even begin to imagine. Anyways, guys, sorry about the glare. Really low and strong sun right now. I'm gonna head down into Harpers Ferry, and I will see you later.